To the Fall 2023 Student Debates. My name is Sophia Perez, and I am the Executive Director of the Political Student Assembly. I, along with Eli, the President of the Political Union, will serve as your moderators for today's debate. The purpose of this debate is to promote diverse, healthy political discourse on campus through a bipartisan discussion of the most pressing political issues facing our nation today. In doing so, we want to ensure each voice is respected, healthy political discourse is respected and heard. Accordingly, the USC Political Student Assembly and the USC Political Union does not endorse any of the views shared here today and will not tolerate any comments made to discriminate against any suspect class. On to the debate topics. Today we will be debating first, abortion, second, foreign policy, third, education rights, and fourth, cash bail. With that, here are the ground rules for today's debate.
There will be 4 topics discussed today. Each debater will have 3 minutes for opening statements, 1 minute for rebuttal, 4 minutes for cross debate, and 4 minutes for moderated questioning. Debaters must respect the allotted time limits for the debate. Time limits on statements, answers, rebuttals, and responses will be enforced by the moderator during the debate to ensure fairness to all candidates. We will gavel once when you have 10 seconds left, and then gavel repeatedly once your time has elapsed. It'll sound like this if you go way over. Debaters may not engage in crosstalk. Respect one another's comments and wait your turn. If you take time from another debater, time will be docked from your own turn. It is the moderator's responsibility and discretion to enforce time limits and interrupt accordingly. To our audience, we expect the same level of respect from y'all as we do our debaters to ensure a smooth, friendly environment. Clicking, snapping, or cheering is allowed, and we ask the audience to hold their applause until the very end of each round. So don't clap throughout. Wait to the very end. We will strike the gavel once when you have 15 seconds left to reply, and 2 times when your time has elapsed. Good luck with the debate. Be a good one.
And with that, may we have our abortion debaters come up to the stage. Thank you. Abortion is among the most contentious issues facing our nation today. Last summer, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, opening the door for states to ban abortion outright. In the years since the decision, 14 states have made abortion illegal. Pro-choice advocates argue that a woman should have complete autonomy over her body and the right to make decisions about her own health. Whereas pro-life advocates, however, argue on moral and ethical grounds that human life, including the life of an unborn child, should be protected. For the debaters, should women have the right to choose to get an abortion? What role should the government play in regulating this arena, and what abortion policies do you believe should be adopted? GOP, 3 minutes for opening statements.
Thank you. Good evening. So I think abortion is a conflict of rights issue. I think there's inherently a conflict between the woman's right to bodily autonomy and the right that I believe the fetus has to be protected from violence. So they kind of break down both sides of that. The reason I think fetuses have a right to be protected from violence is that I can't think of a consistent way to define what gives a person, what gives you and me our equal right to be protected from violence that is going to apply to and include all born humans, but exclude fetuses. I think the only logically consistent way to affirm equal rights is to say that all humans have the equal right to be protected from violence, including adults and teenagers and children and toddlers and infants and fetuses. And then I think bodily autonomy is an incredibly important right, and our country has done an abysmal job of protecting and respecting it, particularly for women and for other vulnerable or minority groups. But I think that I also can't see a consistent way to say that one person's right to bodily autonomy outweighs another person's right to be protected from violence, the right not to be killed. And so even though bodily autonomy is an incredibly important right, I don't think it gives us the right to kill another innocent person. And so I do think that abortion should be illegal, except in cases where it's necessary to save the woman's life. I think if pregnancy is like a triage case, like any other triage case, you have 2 patients, the woman and the fetus. And in cases where you can save both lives, you should absolutely do that. But in cases where that's not possible, it should absolutely be legal to intervene in order to save the woman's life, even if that procedure is then coded as an abortion. I also know that statistically, there are people in this room who've had an experience with an abortion. And so I also want to speak to that really quickly. First of all, I'm so sorry. I think regardless of what your views on the ethics or legality of abortion are, we should all be able to agree that that's very often a really traumatic situation and a really traumatic experience. And I'm sorry that you have been through that. One question that I often get is like, okay, you're saying that abortion is killing an innocent person. Does that mean that you think it's murder? Does that mean that you think that women who get abortions are murderers? And the answer to that is no. Murder is a legal term and it carries with it the idea of like, the technical term is mens rea, but of like knowingly killing an innocent person and being like fully culpable for that the way you would be, again, for knowingly killing somebody. And I do think that, like, I think women who get abortions have a vast array of culpability, if I'm right, that it's killing an innocent person. I think if I were to get an abortion, I do think that I would be, knowing that it is killing an innocent person, I think I would be just as culpable for that as for killing any other person. But I think the vast majority of women who get abortions are not in that position. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan, 3 minutes for opening statement.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and I'm a 20-year-old college student here at USC. But say I wanted to transfer to our southern namesake, the U of SC, which is not the real USC. But anyways, I would be entitled to less of my bodily autonomy simply because I crossed the state line. And why is that? Nothing about me changed, nothing about the way a fetus develops changes when you cross the state line. It's simply because a medical procedure has become politicized and made inaccessible to many women. According to Pew Research, 69% of Americans believe that abortion in the first trimester should be legal, and yet 25 million Americans in 21 states are not able to readily access this medical procedure. A majority of pro-life advocates utilize the life begins at conception argument, which is inherently tied to religion, and prioritize the life of a fetus over a mother, and argue that people get abortions until birth or sometimes after birth. Let me be clear, 93.1% of abortions are performed before 13 weeks and 99% are performed before the third trimester. And that remaining 1% only occurs when there are severe fetal abnormalities and it is clear the fetus will not survive. And after birth abortion is not possible because an abortion is literally defined as a medical procedure to terminate a pregnancy, and that's what it is, a medical procedure. We can sit here all day and debate when life begins and when the distinction of personhood is applied, and truthfully, we're not really going to get anywhere because scientists, philosophers, politicians have been making this debate for decades. It all boils down to restricting the decisions women can make about their own bodies. Nobody should have the right to tell a person what they can and cannot do with their own body. No other medical precedent exists where you can force another individual to provide a life-supporting measure. You can't force someone to donate an organ, blood, bone marrow, stem cells. It just doesn't exist. So why should that be applicable to fetuses? Letting legislators with no medical experience dictate when and under what circumstances women can have bodily autonomy over their reproductive features is quite frankly ridiculous. Women have almost died because physicians don't know if their conditions qualify as life-threatening enough. Let that sit in. Doctors are now arbitrating what is life-threatening enough so they can save their patients. And this isn't just in the abstract. This happened last year in Texas. A woman named Amanda was pregnant, and she and her husband had done IVF treatments. They were really excited to have a child. But unfortunately, Amanda's water broke at 18 weeks, and it was clear that her fetus would miscarry and that there was no way to continue the pregnancy. However, because Amanda lived in Texas, there was no way for her to receive the necessary abortion that was dictated for her medical plan to save her life. When a woman's water breaks prematurely, they're at risk for life-threatening infections like sepsis. But Amanda couldn't get the abortion that she needed to save her life until she developed one of these conditions because her doctor, if proven wrong and did an abortion before it was medically necessary, will be thrown in jail for life. So her doctor and her were stuck waiting for a decision, waiting for a condition that could kill her to save her life. Restricting abortion doesn't reduce the amount of abortions, it simply makes them more dangerous. Data shows that rates don't change due to legality, but maternal mortality does. 62.2% increase is seen when abortion is mandated. At the end of the day, women will die unless we are allowed to make decisions about our own reproductive futures.
Thank you. 1 minute for GOP for rebuttal.
Thank you. So I don't want any woman to get hurt or to die in an abortion, legal or illegal. I think illegal. I think pro-life people need to do a much better job of being really clear about how they talk about abortion, particularly in cases of the life of the mother. It is the case that every pro-life law in the books has an exception for the life of the mother. I think ultimately we should be trusting doctors to make these decisions. Doctors are trained to make triage decisions when there are multiple lives at stake. So I don't think that the law should be like trying to be really specific about how much of a risk does there have to be. We can trust doctors and trust women to make those decisions. I also want to address the concern that this is like a religious kind of thing. I think it's not. There are lots of things that I don't like or that go against my religion or that I even think are morally wrong that I don't think should be illegal. I think abortion is different because I think it's a human rights violation. I think it's killing an innocent person. And unlike my religious or moral beliefs, that's the kind of thing that should be illegal. And a human rights violation, killing an innocent person. Thank you. A minute for rebuttal.
So I want to touch on the idea that we can just trust doctors to make a decision. Obviously, yeah, we can trust doctors too, but the problem is that politicians aren't investing that trust in the doctor. If you're a doctor and you spent however many years it takes to become pre-med and then go to your medical school and then your residency, and then you have the risk of being thrown in prison for life because you don't know whether or not a legislator who has never had a day of medical experience in your life will agree with your medical decision to save the life of your patient. Inherently, that's going to cause a hesitancy behind a medical provider to save that woman's life, whether or not we want to acknowledge that. And I want to talk about this idea of violence towards the fetus. The idea of violence towards a fetus inherently indicates that you believe that a fetus is a human being entity that is capable of feeling and things like that. Science shows that that's not true. You can see in the stages of development of a fetus, the National Health Institute states that fetuses can't feel pain or establish consciousness until 24 gestational weeks, well into the third trimester, when most abortions are completed. 99% are completed before that date. So it's not violence against a person; it's removal of fetus.
Thank you. We will now enter in 4 minutes of class debate.
Thank you. So I'll just address the last point that you made. Yeah, I think I agree with you. Obviously, fetuses at very early stages don't have consciousness. But I think if consciousness is what gives us our equal right to be protected from violence, then somebody in like a temporary reversible coma would have an equal right to be protected from violence. So I think that doesn't work as a standard for what gives us an equal right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are other standards as well. If you want to talk about the standards for personhood, I think that's something that we can definitely discuss. The five, for everyone else in the room, the five main characteristics of personhood are consciousness / a capacity for pain, the ability to reason, autonomy, which is self-sufficiency, the capacity for communication, and self-awareness. So in your case, for someone who's in a coma, they fulfill the autonomy because they can survive without life support for a person. A fetus checks none of those boxes. They are completely self-reliant on the mother to survive. If you remove them from that womb before the date of viability, they will not survive. They do not fulfill any of the check boxes for personhood. So that's, I think, where we define, what is given to people who are in comas or people who are suffering from, things that they're unconscious for long periods of time. It's not the same as not forming consciousness. They have had it and they've lost it, but they're able to still survive because of that. And that's inherently different than a fetus because they were never alive to begin with in the first place.
Yeah, so I think if we say that those five things are all necessary for what it is to be a person or what it is to have equal rights, to be protected from violence, I think that doesn't quite work because those are things that you can have some of and not all of, or that you can have in degrees. And I think it's I think equality is really important. It's important that we all have these rights equally, and so we're the same in that.
Yeah, I never said you needed all five, but they only have one. Out of all of those, fetuses doesn't have a single one. I never said a fetus needs to fulfill all five because it's clear people in comas, they don't have the ability to communicate because they can't speak, but they still fulfill autonomy. A fetus fulfills none of the criteria for personhood. While they fulfill the criteria for a living organism, so does yeast when you add sugar to it. So when you discard sour to starter, that's not murder. So I don't think that, saying that they need to fulfill, I never said they need to fulfill all five aspects of personhood, but they don't fulfill any. So.
Sure. So I think there are lots of, again, like you said, different views about what constitutes personhood and things like that. I think, so imagine you have an infant who was born unconscious somehow. I don't have a specific case, but that's a hypothetical that could happen, and is still unconscious to this day. So we've got a week-old infant, never had any of your five conditions. But I think it's pretty clear that it would be wrong to kill that infant. That infant isn't a person.
Yes, but it would be autonomous because it would be breathing on its own, even if it's not breathing, its heart would be beating. It would be able to be self-sufficient apart from its mother. It wouldn't be reliant on the umbilical cord for nutrition. Once a fetus is born, it's a baby. It's a living thing. It has the ability to sustain itself, and it's, it's not an abortion if that, it's just, that's not applicable here. And I want to talk about, since we're having this really passionate debate about when personhood applies, why do you believe that your definition of when personhood should be applied supersedes the majority of Americans? And every single ballot issue that has regarded reproductive choice since 2020 in 7 states have all gone in favor of reproductive justice, even in states like Kentucky, which are R+15. Even most recently in Ohio last night, where 2.2 million people decided that they wanted to have this right. So why does your belief on what personhood should begin supersede those millions of people because you believe you're more right than they are?
Yeah, so the fact that I think abortion is wrong says absolutely nothing. I don't think that the fact that I don't like it or the fact that I think it's wrong or whatever, certainly like the fact that it's against my religion or anything like that would mean that it should be illegal. But if I'm right, and I think I have good arguments for it, if I'm right that fetuses are people, then it's not just that I think it's wrong, it's that it is, in fact, a human rights violation.
But what if I'm right and it's a human rights violation to deprive millions of women of reproductive health care?
Yeah.
And they will die because of it. Because
If you're right that fetuses aren't people, then abortion should absolutely be legal.
Thank you both. We will now enter into 3 minutes for moderated questioning. First, for the GOP side. We've talked at length about definitions of personhood. However, I do have a question for you, and it is, how do you view the role of government in regulating or prohibiting abortion?
Yeah, so I think, again, if I'm right, and big if, but if I'm right that fetuses are people, that what gives us this personhood has to be something like human nature, then that is the kind of thing that the government has an obligation to protect, just like it makes killing any other kind of person illegal. Again, the government doesn't have a role in legislating all kinds of religious or moral questions, but it does have a right and it does have a role in prohibiting human rights violation and prohibiting the killing of an innocent person.
Thank you.
A question for the Democratic side. Democrats have missed numerous opportunities to enshrine in federal law a right to abortion when they had even held huge majorities in Congress. That's started in Obama administrations. And at the same time, to many legal scholars, the court's decision in Roe v. Wade exceeded its constitutional authority. Why this inaction by the Democratic Party? And will states like Ohio be the ones responsible for enshrining into their own constitutions the right to abortion due to Democratic inaction on the federal level?
Yeah, so amazing question. I get this question a lot, and I think it's important to note that in the Obama years when we held that supermajority in Congress, 25% of Democrats weren't pro-choice. Now we have 1 Democrat in the House who is not pro-choice, so we have much more of a strong majority. In regards to whether or not there should be federal action, I think that was your question, right? If there should be federal action. I believe that a national abortion protection is not only necessary, but it should be strongly encouraged. Why should I be entitled to less of a right simply because I step over a state line into another state? That doesn't exist for very few other protections. My ability to make decisions on my own body shouldn't vary from state to state. And moreover, that disproportionately affects a lot of people who are unable to travel. If you therefore say that it's up to the states, then affluent members of that, or affluent residents of those states will be able to travel and go to safe haven states like California and obtain abortion care. But that leaves lower income Americans at risk. And with the high maternal mortality rate we have in this nation, it's a disservice. We have, I believe it's 23 per 100,000 maternal mortality deaths. In the UK, it's 10. In Germany or France, it's 4. So forcing lower income Americans to go through this experience when wealthy Americans are able to just cross state lines is a disservice to them. Thank you.
And with that, we conclude our first topic. Please join me in giving our debaters a round of applause. Will all the foreign policy debaters please step up?
Okay, I'll start with a question now. So, cease the undercurrents. So since its inception, the United States has played a significant role in global affairs, often involving itself in foreign policy decisions, military interventions, and providing humanitarian aid to other countries, which ranges from international agreements on climate change to humanitarian and military aid. Different administrations throughout our own history have taken fundamentally different approaches to how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world. Proponents of active engagement in foreign affairs argue that it is crucial for maintaining international stability to uphold American values and promote democracy and human rights. However, opponents of that position argue that the United States should prioritize the self-determination of other countries in their own affairs. So essentially, like, take a step back. As well as reduce its own military presence abroad and focus on strengthening our own economy and infrastructure. So the question is, what is the role of the United States in foreign affairs? And should the U.S. increase its presence in foreign policy initiatives, obviously internationally, or adopt a more isolationist approach going forward?
Dan's 3 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to point out kind of how broad this question is to start. There's a lot I could talk about, and I'd like to narrow it a bit to the role of the U.S. military. We obviously spend more than any other nation on earth on our military, and it has a significant role in our foreign policy. I think when most of us think about U.S. foreign policy, we specifically think of U.S. intervention on foreign conflicts. The military, in theory, is used by the American government to protect our interests abroad, which obviously changes quite a lot from administration to administration. In reality, it has been used to destroy things that we think threaten our short-term interests rather than helping develop structures to protect our long-term interests. For example, 20 years ago, we invaded Iraq for about a month and annihilated an entire nation. Millions of civilians, because of that war, were killed, and tens of thousands of American service members died there and in the Middle East more broadly, including Afghanistan, where obviously for most of our lives we were. We occupied Afghanistan because of protecting U.S. interests abroad to prevent the spread of terror. Of course, that goal failed. As we can see, the Middle East is still currently incredibly unstable. We also chose to invade Vietnam, in which millions of civilians in that region, including in Cambodia and Laos, and millions of American service members develop developmental diseases and cancers, including my grandfather who passed away in 2011 from prostate cancer due to exposure to Agent Orange. My point is that the U.S. military fundamentally is a destructive force. So whether or not we are involved abroad, the military should not be used as a weapon of to impose our values on other countries. We can see that our current goal of protecting U.S. interests abroad and maintaining global stability does not work. In Eastern Europe, obviously there's a land war. The Middle East is currently engrossed in conflict, and Taiwan is seeing rising tensions like never before. I know this is not the only way to go about this, because there is another global superpower that has been outcompeting us both economically and strategically using a completely different strategy. China has been focusing on both domestic and foreign development by investing in its own economy and foreign economies using the Belt and Road Initiative. They've been creating alternative economic mechanisms through BRICS, all while managing to grow their own domestic economy. The U.S. should not focus on destruction of things it views as morally wrong or threatening, because it cannot afford to continue to lose to places like China by focusing on military force.
Thank you. 3 minutes for opening statements, the GOP.
So since the events of World War II, it was proven that foreign policy approaches of internationalism, isolationism adopted by the U.S. was impractical. Pretty much administrations beginning with Truman injected American soldiers into other countries and provided economic aid to them with other nations as a way to shield our own country from future conflicts. But unfortunately, this is also not very effective. More recent internationalism policies of funding global organizations have exploited the U.S. for threats that are more pertinent to other member nations. According to the BBC in 2021, it is estimated that the U.S. has spent more money in 2020 than any other of the 29 NATO countries, accommodating just over 3.7% of our own GDP in NATO defense, while the contribution of European members was about 1.77% on average. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the U.S. is the most generous of 193 member donors, to the UN and contributed more than $12 billion to the organization in 2021, about 3/4 of which was voluntarily donated by our own Congress. This contribution accounted for just under 1/5 of the funding for the body's collective budget, and is almost equal in magnitude to the funding that we allocate to the U.S. Coast Guard. But unfortunately, since then, the U.S. contribution has grown, and this year the UN assessed our own nation's share of 22%, which is a 2% increase since the past 2 years. But despite the vast funding of the UN has failed to assemble member nations in taking action to stunt the spread of COVID-19 while declaring the pandemic 2 weeks too late, and has failed to suppress the recent outbreaks in the Russia-Ukraine war and Israel-Hamas wars, as well as violence in both Rwanda and Mali. And so excessively funding this organization and others that are global, worldwide is ineffective in a waste of our money. Internationalist policies providing aid to adversarial countries have also failed. According to the U.S. Agency of International Development, the United States remains the largest donor to humanitarian efforts in Afghanistan, calling for about $2.26 billion in aid for 20 million people between June and December of this year. But in 2021, at a time when we were paying $2 billion in aid, the Taliban was collecting sufficient revenues to pay for almost, if not all, of its operating costs, while carrying out damaging policies to their economy, such as bans on female education, prohibitions against Afghan women, and the mass exodus of educated citizens from the country, which has obviously degraded their well-being. So furthermore, some of the weapons that have been left behind in Afghanistan by the Biden administration have resurfaced in armed conflicts around the world, such as those in India and Israel, and the improvement of Iran's economy through the nuclear deal has shown no increase in the income of the average Iranian household. But meanwhile, in the U.S., about more than 400,000 people are homeless, and people are struggling with the current inflation. So it's for these reasons, many more, that we should adopt a more isolationist approach.
Thank you. 1 minute for rebuttal, Debs.
So I guess I've heard a lot of reasons why we're not spending our money really wisely. The question is, should we spend that on domestic policy only, or maybe shift our policy abroad using that funding? I personally think we should cut military funding quite a lot. But I think that investing in institutions like the UN is actually a perfect use of our money. I also would just say that there is a difference between giving people aid, which is essentially many times a blank check, and active development efforts. I mentioned the Belt and Road initiatives. There's plenty of other countries that have foreign development initiatives in which they lay out specific infrastructure projects or something else with a clear budget in mind, right? And that country is actively involved in another country's development. So we don't have to just hand out blank checks. And I agree that we shouldn't. By the way, about 73% of our military budget is completely unaccounted for. So you're right, we are sending out blank checks, but that's not the only way to do things.
Thank you. 1 minute rebuttal, GOP.
I think we should focus more on domestic policy, domestic funding, in the sense that UN and other global organizations have been a waste of funds and effort. I mean, they don't help us at all with COVID, any diseases, wars, everything that it was meant and founded upon has been completely, it's failed to do what it was made to do. So, in terms of setting a budget, I think with Afghanistan and other countries, we have done that. But what happens is that they take the funds that we allocate to them and they take that amount of money out of their own budget and use it for other stuff. So, in the result, we're pretty much just funding, pretty much helping other countries defeat us in terms of, nuclear programs, weapons development, etc. So, I think in general, just reducing the amount maybe give to any country and focusing more on American infrastructure and well-being of citizens will be the way to go.
Thank you. We will now enter into 4 minutes for cross debate.
Okay, I guess I'll respond to that a bit. I wanted to ask about this idea that we need to invest in domestic policy because it's the only way to grow our economy, right? China's obviously pulling ahead of us in a lot of fields, and they're sort of starting to lead global efforts around battery manufacturing and the clean transition to a cleaner economy. How would investing in our domestic policy and forgetting these other countries that are, let's be honest, they're all making this transition and we all have to do it together. What happens when we sort of abandon those connections and stop investing in their efforts?
Well, I'm a little bit confused on why we would want to invest in other countries who are not developing battery technology. I mean, would you want to invest in China, battery technology, or
China doesn't need our money.
Okay, so U.S. and China are pretty much the two major developing countries making technology that's pretty much better than the other countries. So, which other countries would you want to invest in? I guess.
Well, let's look at China. Personally, I know that they're investing in a lot of African countries, specifically the DRC, and I know there's a lot of human rights violations going on there. If only there was a Western liberal democracy, you could spend some money helping set up some infrastructure to mine cobalt and lithium in those countries in a more humanitarianly friendly way. I think those types of countries are where we should be investing in. Manufacturing and things like that, I think are still going to be happening in places like America and China and developing countries, the global south. But I think in many regions right now, they just need some sort of infrastructure to help us in this transition, which can look like a lot of different things for a lot of different countries. I
think we have a lot of these mines and ores here in the United States. Just like looking about the state of California, there are a lot of mines, lithium mines, other minerals that are within our own country that we can, take out that have unfortunately been restricted by democratic administrations because of, environmental restrictions, other policies such as that. So I think more investing in technology companies in the U.S., maybe loosening the restrictions on oil companies, maybe loosening the restriction on mining companies, so that we can make that transition while benefiting American citizens instead of African countries or, some other foreign group. I think that would be the most beneficial to our country. I know China may be having some influence in Uganda or some other African states that you're mentioning, but I mean, what better way to flourish technology than to help those who are developing? I mean, we have technology companies in the U.S. and then mine cores in the U.S. So I think that makes the most sense to me.
I guess I would just say that excuse me. Development in the U.S. or development abroad can take many different forms, and I think thinking only in terms of how we can develop our own industries is a little short-sighted because we're not alone. We are solving really global problems here, global poverty and honestly, especially for our generation, climate change. I do not see a world in which the U.S. focuses on our own economic development by loosening restrictions for fossil fuel companies and mining companies, and we still address climate change the way we need to. We are the leading emitter, and so is China. They're currently leading in emissions. Of course, we're leading in historical emissions. If we're not going to do something about it, if we're not going to help other countries do something about it and develop cleanly, I don't know who will.
I don't see the difference in mining in Africa or mining in the United States. I mean, if you want to stop global warming, why stop mining overall? Why not stop warming?
Thank you both. We will now go into the moderated questioning. We have a bit of a twist.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Lawrence Song, and I represent Glimpse from the Globe, USC's premier international affairs publication and one of the sponsors of the 2023 Fall Student Debate. On behalf of the publication, I want to thank the USC Political Student Assembly, the USC Political Union, and the USC Center for Political Future for hosting this event and allowing us to ask the moderated questions during the segment. On behalf of our reporters, I ask the following to the Trojan Democrats. Many presidents have made defending global democracy a primary piece of their foreign policy agendas. Yet when it came to alleged human rights violations committed by strategic partners, their responses were muted. In addition, some countries view Western advocacy for liberal democratic values as an effort to force them to accept Western ideals that conflict with their own. Thus, how should U.S. foreign policy navigate the balance between promoting democratic values, American interests, and respect for other cultures?
I guess I would say that liberal democracy is an American value, and I think that that is the highest American value. I think you're specifically referring to Saudi Arabia and the killing of a journalist on foreign soil, as well as the genocide in Yemen. We should not be supporting that government, full stop. we should not be meeting with that government, full stop. Yes, they're a strategic partner, and they, I guess, are a good military ally in the region. Is that really more important than the millions of people dying at their hands? No. I think it's as simple as that. We have to draw a line somewhere, and the death of innocent civilians has to be that line.
Thank you, Trojan Democrats. To USC GUP, I know you may have touched upon this during the previous segments of this topic, but I will ask it again. The One Belt, One Road initiative, China's signature foreign policy project, aims to bring about economic partnerships with countries from around the world through infrastructure development and closer trade ties. Its relatively unconditional and generous terms have been an especially popular draw for developing countries who require $40 trillion in the next 2 decades to bridge infrastructure gaps. Critics argue the project is designed to make member states dependent on China and force them to support Chinese interests, yet no alternative has been proposed by the U.S. to aid these countries, even as it competes with China for global influence. What should the United States do to fill this gap in its foreign policy towards developing countries, if anything?
I don't think that too much can be done. I mean, you take a look at countries that we have invested in. For example, Venezuela, providing them with some material to mine oil, and then they take the U.S. property and decide that they want to keep it. We try to help some foreign countries develop their economies and develop their infrastructures, and then kind of backfires and hurts ourselves. So I think only investing in maybe, I know that China is having a large influence on other aspects of the world because of their investments in other countries. But I think to an extent, I think using that funds that we would be investing in other countries, maybe targeting it towards ourselves would be more of an effective, and maybe strengthening our allies to help combat the reach of China and other adversaries would be the most effective response.
Thank you, and with that, we conclude our second topic. Please help me in giving our debaters a round of applause. Well, our third debaters, please come to the stage to talk about education grants. Thank you. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed law into legislation, that restricts public school instruction on topics of race, gender identity, and sexual orientation. DeSantis has implemented book banning, has changed academic standards, and most recently has announced a ban on the College Board's Advanced Placement African American Studies course. Advocates argue that these policies are necessary to enforce educational standards that reflect the values of that society without furthering political agendas or infringing on the roles of parents. Opponents, however, argue that educational institutions and educators should have the freedom to teach the content that best suits the academic goals and needs of their students, which includes discussion of diverse perspectives. To what extent should officials have the authority to influence the context of educational materials, curriculum, and classroom discussions, especially when it involves topics that are related to race, history, and societal values? 3 minutes for opening statements, GOP.
Thank you very much. Hey all, my name is Daniel, and I'm a conservative. I'm going to be a little scary. I've had my fair share of bad experiences, but I think we have a lot more in common on this issue than we'd like to believe. I think this question is one of the left, and not of liberalism, because I respect and I value liberalism. I think liberals are a very important thing. Even if I do believe that they may have a slightly flawed view of the world, I still think that they are very important to our system of government. So let's evaluate this question on its merits. Does the government have the authority to influence the content of educational materials, curriculum, and classroom discussion? Well, the obvious answer there is yes. And I say that because common sense says someone's going to write the curriculum, someone's going to make the rules. And if the government runs public schools, then the government has to be the one who makes those decisions. Now, if we're going to approach this from a legal standpoint, if you can bear with me through some tedious legal jargon, there's a multiplicity of legal cases that deal with teacher speech, student speech, classroom discussion, curriculum, and other classroom activities that the Supreme Court and the Circuit Court have deemed that states have the ability to regulate. They have made it clear that speech in the classroom is not quote unquote free. It has to be tempered with good judgment to avoid non-academic and sensitive topics. A couple examples are Tinker versus the Des Moines School District, or Hazelwood School District versus Kumar. That's my best attempt at that name. If my opponent wishes, I have a much more exhaustive list that talks about these things. We can do that across debate. And also, according to the U.S. Department of Education, it requires that all students in America be taught to high academic standards, and the enforcement of that standard is left to the states. So now that we know that the government holds this authority, the question is, why does that change if we're going to talk about race, if we're going to talk about sexuality, if we're going to talk about history? And I think the real answer is that the leftists, not the liberals, want full control of the schools, and they want free range to teach and influence the younger generation in whatever way they see fit. And I disagree. The U.S. is a melting pot of people, ideas, and religions with a vast array of ideas and value systems. And I think if you're going to enforce the minority's viewpoint on the majority, that's wrong. And the only values that should be taught in the classroom are hard work, teamwork, good manners, a love for learning, and definitely not critical race theory, blatantly false and selectively written history, or LGBTQ propaganda. Starting at age 10, children's brains undergo a fundamental shift that spurs them to seek social rewards, including attention and approval from their peers. And I think at such a malleable age, they should not be exposed to any of these things. And I think it's our job to protect their innocence and to allow their parents to teach them and to allow them to grow up and make decisions for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. 3 minutes opening statements for Dennis.
Hello. Hi. My name is Elizabeth Frankton. My grandmother attended segregated school in rural North Carolina. There, she read a book called The Story of Little Black Sambo by Helen Bannerman. It's a children's book that depicts African Americans as uncivilized and uneducated. Almost 60 years later, my grandmother still remembers reading that book and the shameful emotions it brought, and she wondered if there would be any other depictions of Black Americans in her education. I think about her story when I think about this topic. Students are growing up in a diverse country, which should be reflected in their education. The policies of Governor DeSantis do not reflect apolitical teaching, but instead reinforce a backward perspective. Topics of race and sexuality, when taught at the appropriate grade level, can be foundational for students. These lessons also provide insight into the real world and better prepare them to navigate difficult situations and events. Regarding race, DeSantis is a model for harmful policies. One of his most notable bills is SB 145, which defines educational discussions of race as state-sanctioned racism and prohibits educators from making students feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish on the grounds of race. It's established that no party would support a teacher belittling students on behalf of their identity, but reducing lessons to emotional plight is a sad excuse to deny history. The National Education Association seconds this idea, arguing that race should be taught focusing on two aspects. The first of which is that racism exists as a larger idea and is not something to individually blame a student or a person for, and that discussions should promote belonging rather than exclusion. Regarding sex education, studies show that comprehensive sex ed can reduce teen pregnancy and risky sexual behaviors amongst adolescents, according to the ACOG. This also includes healthy discussions of sexual orientation, decision-making, consent, and relationships. According to Planned Parenthood, only 39 states actively mandate sex ed in schools, and less than half of all high schools teach all comprehensive requirements from the CDC. We are failing American students and endangering their future by not teaching this. It's difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all approach to this issue. Liberal-leaning states such as Colorado follow a highly localized school system and with no state requirements on educational content and still Facebook bans. Government involvement isn't uniform, and ways for parents to influence their children's education do exist. Municipal school board elections were held this year, elections that historically have little turnout at roughly 10%. Further, only 12% of parents can report interacting with the school board member, and 15% have attended a school board meeting. It will take an active and unified effort between parents, educators, and students to find middle ground on this issue. It is true that conversations about this can be difficult, but in a nurturing educational environment, these lessons can better prepare adolescents for their lives outside of school. We must understand that if education does not challenge us, we are not being well educated.
Thank you. 1 minute rebuttal for GOP. Please save your applause to the end. Thank you.
I would agree with you. I think the system is broken. I think the public school system is not what it was intended for. I think the public school system was created a long time ago, and it hasn't been maintained properly. And so I would agree with you there. Yeah, the system is messed up. The system needs to be fixed. But I think pointing to Ron DeSantis and saying that his specific policies are the issue, I think is incorrect. Because one of the other bills that he passed, HB 551, actually requires African American instruction. So it's not the erasure of a minority group. It's not the putting down of someone because they are Black and can't speak or read. That's never the intent. The intent is to keep these critical race theories, these ideas on sexuality that a 10-year-old can never hope to comprehend out of the classroom, and to allow them as mature adults like me and you to make that decision much later in life outside of outside influence. So I think we have a lot of common ground there. I think we do disagree on some things, and I think one of them being is that critical race theory and curriculum along those lines just don't belong in our elementary schools. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, again, I do agree we have a lot of common ground on this, but I mentioned sex ed at the appropriate age level. I can't think of any sane school district that would teach high school level sex ed to a 10-year-old. You know, like discussions about sexuality, consent relationships typically do not begin, I'd say, before 9th grade for most school. I'm speaking on behalf of my educational experience. And sex ed was, we understand in middle school, is usually information about menstruation, very basic, if not like bodily anatomy. And I second that. I understand that the education system does need to be reworked, but it's very difficult to say that harsh sexuality is being taught to 10-year-olds.
Thank you. 4 minutes for cross debate.
Yeah, I think we can definitely agree on that. I think 10 years old maybe like somewhere everyone can agree. And the funny thing is that Ron DeSantis is being attacked for taking these things out of the school system because the only time limit that he has ever proposed in any of his bills has been at 3rd grade level, which is around 10 years old, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. And so many of those on the left, the leftists, not the liberals, have an issue with keeping this type of curriculum away from 10-year-olds. So that's where that came from. I think we can agree on that. I think high school is probably the place to start teaching some of that. I think that can be a more nuanced conversation that we have. But I think if we're going to talk about this topic in light of Florida's legislation, it would be remiss of us to miss out that the only type of time limit that's put on this issue has been 3rd grade, has been 10 years old. And I have a little brother who's 7, and there is no way in hell that he understands critical race theory. He understands LGBTQ issues. So I'm personally advocating that at the very least, I think what Ron DeSantis passed was important. It was totally within his authority to do. And I think if we want to have a conversation about, okay, well, where's the line then? When's the time to do it? I think that's a healthy place that we can go. But I think if we're agreeing here, I think that it's really important to make that distinction of these bills that we're talking about that are in the actual question are not objectionable for that reason.
I do want to respond to your point about critical race theory being taught in high school or middle school. From what I understand, critical race theory is mostly taught in graduate programs. It's not something that is often. I took AP, I took Black Studies in high school, and I wouldn't consider that critical race theory. It was before that term was even thrown around. No one defined it as that. And when we talk about critical race theory, what we're really talking about is these books about African Americans that are showing up in schools that are getting restricted by Ron DeSantis. And they're not books that argue for the obliteration of anyone who's not Black. They're books like To Kill a Mockingbird or The Bluest Eye that simply just discuss race in a way that's kind of uncomfortable. Would that be considered critical race theory?
No, I don't think so. If I can take the liberty of reading from HB 551, it says that there are a few things that need to be taught. The history of African Americans before the political conflicts that led to the development of slavery, the passage of America through the enslavement experience, abolition, and the history of slavery, and the contributions of Americans of African of Americans of African descent to society. So none of these things are critical race theory. Those are what are being endorsed. I think the issue is when you're making people feel bad about themselves because of their race. And unfortunately, we see that with very young school children talking about very intense issues, playing race politics. And race politics is only ever divisive. It's never helpful. And that's where I think this comes from. That's where you see people on the right, conservatives, saying, we're not okay with this. Yeah, I think, obviously, the contribution of African Americans to American history is important. It's something that should be valued and should be taught. I think the difference is when you're going to bring race politics into this problem, now that's a line that people like myself and people on the right are not okay with.
I think discussing racism in school is race politics, but what's inherently wrong with it? It's something that we encounter in our real lives. It's something that we don't even think about that still affects us. So why would that be inherently harmful?
I'm confused by the question. Could you clarify what you mean by that? I'm sorry.
Why is discussing racial politics harmful to students?
But there's a difference between talking about racial politics and playing on race relations. And those are two separate things. And I think if we're going to talk about, yeah, obviously there was a lot of race relations issues for a lot of America's history, and some of them still persist to this day. But I think putting them on the forefront and bringing them up as big issues is an entirely different thing. And I think when you're going to tell a little white girl in third grade that she's a bad person because she's white, or you're going to tell a little brown boy in second grade that he has privilege because he's black, that's wrong. And I think that's where the critical race issue is an issue that people on the right are not okay.
Thank you. We will now enter into our moderated questioning. For GOP first. So conservatives often emphasize limited government intervention and support for local control in education. Can you explain how your view on the increased role of the federal government, in education policy aligns with your overall conservative principles?
I think the government sucks at everything it does. I mean, I don't really know what else to say to that besides that I think at the state level, Florida is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's given the authority by its constituents, by the Constitution, by the United States government to regulate Florida education. So I think that fits perfectly in line with conservative ideals. I think small government is the best form of government. I think USC students know best the issues that are applicable to USC students, and that's why USC student government is an important thing. I don't think that some delegation at the California State Board of Education knows what's best for us here. And that's an example of big government telling little government what to do, and I just don't think that's a healthy way to go about going governance. And I think in this case, you see someone who's within his authority and his jurisdiction to do what he's doing what his constituents have asked of him. And so, yeah, in conclusion, the federal government is wasteful, it is inefficient, and especially when it comes to education, it has failed the system for a long, long time. Thank you.
We'll have a response from Democrats.
For a moderated question for the Democrats.
Actually, yes. Thank you so much. Also, I saw the water all over the stage. It's not been.
Go ahead.
I saw it. So it's a long question. We might give you. We'll give you the same. Also, camera yet. Okay. So to many Republicans, eliminating the Department of Education has been a pretty far-fetched campaign promise, but also a pretty substantial one. But many people, including especially proponents of a more localized education standards, have called for more localized education, honestly. So where's the line drawn between localized school systems and what parents can do to decide what their children are learning in school systems on a day-to-day basis, especially in elementary school?
Well, I think it's a bit of a case-by-case situation. Like I mentioned, Colorado, a very blue, very high-ranked in education state, does have a highly localized system where parents do have a lot of input because a lot of the decisions are made by school boards. But states like Florida has a very big state-run education system where the governor, as previously mentioned, will have more influence than a parent. I think some forms of educational oversight might work better for other states. I think, it's ultimately up to their constituents. But I think one is that parents, like I mentioned in my stats, a lot of parents do not show up to school board meetings. guarantee many parents could not name their school board members. I personally can, So I think it's a bit on all of us to really make that decision and get involved at our local education system, because many of us agree, Democrats and Republicans alike, that our education system does need to change, but neither of us really want to step up to the challenge and do anything about it.
Thank you.
And with that, we conclude our third topic, please.
We will now be moving on to cash bail. Big question. Rather, elimination of cash bail. Yes. So yes, so this is okay, so yes, this is the final round. How this round is going to work is obviously we just got a volunteer today from the Democratic and from the Republican side. So, and the Democratic side has gotten a good amount of prep beforehand. So with that, we're going to do something more open for debate. We're going to have the Democratic side do an opening statement, and the Republican side do a rebuttal. And then after that, we'll do a cross debate between the two. It will be less moderated than before. We'll expand that out to, 4 minutes, we'll say? You guys would like, we'll do 3 minutes, But with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna give 3 minutes to the Dems to open. And 4 minutes, right? 4 minutes, we'll give you 4 minutes. So the question is, a statement along with that. In September, Illinois became the first state to completely eliminate the cash bail system. And in a similar vein, Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon, alongside other counties and municipalities across the country, have proposed the same. Advocates for the elimination of the cash bail cite studies that show cash bail disproportionately affects Black, Latino, and low-income communities. However, opponents argue that the cash bail system protects neighborhoods and victims of crimes, as it prevents people accused of crimes from roaming free before trial. Should cash bail be eliminated? If so, how would you respond to public safety concerns? If not, what criminal justice reform should be implemented to account for racial and economic disparities? Give me 4 minutes now.
Yes, cash bail should be eliminated. Cash bail is a policy that disproportionately penalizes low-income and minority communities, leads to worse trial and long-term outcomes for arrestees who are unable to post bail, and fails to enhance the safety of our citizens. To my first point, that cash bail disproportionately penalizes low-income and minority communities. Bail hearings often occur within 48 hours of defendant's arrest. This quick turnaround time often means that defendants cannot obtain a public defender before their bail hearing. According to a paper written by Harvard policy economists, quote, "It is common for bail hearings to only last a few minutes with no defense counsel present. The presiding official may be a magistrate rather than a judge and may not even be a lawyer. Available evidence suggests that bail judges often do not make careful determinations about what bail an arrestee can realistically afford," end quote. This apathetic process leaves more than 60% of defendants unable to pay their bail, resulting in an unnecessary incarceration. Bail hearings also have well-documented racial bias implications. A 2022 report published by the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights found that, quote, "higher pretrial detention rates and financial conditions of release are imposed on Black and Latino individuals," end quote. In an unfortunately not so extreme case, in Philadelphia between 2008 and 2013, 40% of defendants with bail set at only $500 remained jailed pre-trial. This creates a two-tier justice system where the wealthy can buy their freedom while the poor languish behind bars pre-trial, almost always leading to a loss of jobs and housing. That's what led the DOJ to conclude in 2016 that the bail system in many jurisdictions, quote, "are not only unconstitutional, but also constitute bad public policy," end quote. To my second point, that pretrial detainment leads to worse trial and long-term outcomes. Economists estimate that pretrial detention causes detainees to lose roughly $30,000 in foregone earnings and social benefits. Pretrial detention also significantly increases the probability of conviction, primarily through increases in guilty pleas. An econometric analysis of the cash bail system found that, quote, "initial pretrial release decreases the probability of being found guilty by 14 percentage points, or 24.2%. The decrease in conviction is largely driven by a reduction in the probability of pleading guilty, which decreases by 10.8 percentage points or 24.5%. The analysis of this finding is very straightforward. When defendants can secure their release pretrial, they are less likely to be coerced into falsely confessing to a crime. Eliminating the cash bail system would grant defendants this necessary bargaining power. To my third point, that the cash bail system fails to increase the safety of our cities. There are 7 governing bodies that have implemented cashless bail reform that have been the subject of academic research. Cook County, Illinois, Jefferson County, Colorado, Yamaha County, Washington, New York City, Philadelphia, Kentucky, New Jersey. In all 7 cases, researchers found no statistically significant increase in the rearrest rate among people released pre-trial. In the words of the researchers, quote, bail reform can have significant positive impact by increasing the number of people released pre-trial with no impact to public safety or court appearance rates, end quote. Finally, to conclude my speech, I want to give some context as to the size of pretrial detention in the United States. The annual fiscal cost of pretrial jail beds alone for pretrial detention is estimated to be $14 billion and 17% of total spending on corrections. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, there are 11 million pretrial jail admissions annually, and on any given day, there are 500,000 Americans waiting in jail pretrial. The FBI data reports that low-level offenses such as drug abuse violations and disorderly conduct make up over 80% of these arrests, while serious violent offenses account for fewer than 5% of total arrests. When we combine even the most conservative estimates of these 3 statistics, we find that 5 million people, at least Americans, are charged with nonviolent crimes and are forced to await their trial in shackles simply because they do not have the financial means to post bail. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now get to rebuttal by GOP.
For 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Cool, thank you. So obviously, what I was harping on last time, federal government sucks at what it does. We have another example right here. I think we can find a common ground in that the federal bail system probably isn't the most effective. There's definitely things that should be improved. I think on the other hand, there are other ways to go about improving the system and making it more just and making it more beneficial for the populace than just eliminating it entirely. I think there are other means to go about that. I think personally, cash bail should not be eliminated. I think it should stay in effect. I think lawless people are going to do lawless things. And the only way to prevent that is for the state to do one of the few things that it is actually prescribed in the Constitution, and that's protecting citizens. And so the elimination of cash bail, I think, takes a lot of the incentive out of not reoffending. I think if you're going to commit a crime, and then you're just going to be, if you're going to commit a violent crime, which is a large majority of the prison population are violent criminals. I think if you're going to commit a violent crime, it at least indicates that you are a lawless, violent person. And I think lawless, violent people are going to do lawless and violent things unless they're incentivized or forced otherwise. And I think the cash bail system is a manner with which you can provide an incentive to not reoffend. But so, yeah, I don't think it's perfect. I think we can agree on that.
Wonderful.
I think we don't get involved enough in our government. We don't get involved enough in public safety. But I don't think eliminating it is the answer.
Thank you. 1 minute rebuttal.
Yeah, so I just want to say that you mentioned a large majority of the prison community are violent criminals. I don't want to dispute that, but what I do want to say is that prison and jail aren't the same thing. When we're talking about pretrial detention, we're talking about jail inmates. And as I mentioned, 80% of arrests, according to the FBI, are nonviolent. So in jail, most of them are nonviolent offenders. And so that's what I'm saying is they're not public safety risks. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, in the 7 areas where cash bail reform was tried and academic research has been studied on it, no statistically significant increase in crime or reoffense rates was found. So I really hesitate to agree with your statements. That's my rebuttal. Thanks.
Thank you. 4 minutes of cross debate.
So forgive my lack of
Totally fine.
understanding of the specific study, but one thing that I will say is that in cases like this, when you see the federal government going and auditing itself, oftentimes you don't see the best research practices, and so we could have that conversation. I think if you're a non-violent offender, then yeah, you probably made some bad decisions to get yourself in the place that you're in. And I think you need to be held responsible for that. And part of the way of holding someone responsible is through adding a monetary incentive. Because, yes, a nonviolent offense is a nonviolent offense. That's fair.
Okay, so
I think
can I
just today,
let's say one point here. When we talk about punishment, let's just be clear. Cash bail punishes people that are poor, pre-trial. If someone is guilty, I have no problem with them serving a prison sentence, whether they can afford cash bail or not. But what you're saying is there needs to be a monetary incentive pre-trial, which I don't agree with, because that doesn't mean that the rich man that commits a crime doesn't get a jail out of free card until his sentence, because he can afford bail, whereas a poor person cannot. So that's the difference. It's just an inequality.
I think I would question that in that when a judge decides bail, a judge doesn't decide to not give bail to someone's rich. I think it's a practice that, while I'll grant it may not be functional, may not be the best that it could be, but a judge doesn't say, oh, you have money, we're going to let you free. Everybody who makes a bad decision, commits a crime, violates the law, has to have some form of retribution. Some of that is a monetary incentive. Now, I think we can find some common ground in that I do believe that for some of the nonviolent offenders, they are breaking laws that should not be laws. And I think the federal government has implemented a law system that doesn't allow lawful citizens to live their life. And so, yeah, I think I can agree with you there. Maybe some of that 80% are people who shouldn't be there because the government is overreaching and they're putting their fingers maybe they don't belong in.
Okay, let's talk about that. I just want to mention, like, the point that I made about higher pretrial detention rates and financial conditions of release imposed systemically on Black and Latino individuals that I mentioned. So I'd like to hear your solution to address that.
Which part specifically, sir?
You mentioned how there's a monetary incentive that needs to be imposed, but I'm saying that that monetary incentive is disproportionately more for Black and Latino individuals, and how are you going to address that? For the same crime. Like, one crime should not have a higher bail than another if they're the same crime, and white people get lower bails. So how are we going to address that?
I think maybe it's time we take a long, hard look at our criteria. I know that cash bail is set based upon financial ability, flight risks, your likelihood to offend again. So yeah, all those things, while important, maybe it's time that we look at those again. I can agree with you there. But I think at the same time, if you're going to commit and you're going to recommit, then you should face some sort of retribution. And
they do in prison sentence after they're sentenced for the crime when they're found guilty. I'm saying when you're innocent pre-trial, you should not be held to that same standard. And when people are disproportionately arrested for crimes that they end up being non-guilty of, then they are the people that get hurt the most, and they suffer $30,000 of lost income and social government benefits. So maybe we should give $30,000 of reparations to everybody that's arrested and found innocent. What do you think of that?
Well, the bail system works that normally you go to a I don't know what the proper term is, but you go to someone, you get that money for the bail, you give it to the government, and then you get it back if you're innocent. That's how the system works.
So
adding that's the financial incentive there. So we're not talking right now. We're talking people who are innocent who wouldn't necessarily be affected because that bail's going back once they're proven innocent.
But here's the final point here.
We will continue this question during the moderated portion, so you can continue that question to the very end of the questions that are asked on both sides. So that's up to you guys to spend that time as you wish. But we will go on to 1 minute 30 per for each side for moderated questions. So if this is my time, Sophie's got it. So first, we're going to be asking a question to the Democrats. I'm sorry, Ed. So is the problem only that bail is being set too high for minority or financially vulnerable communities, or are there other factors that are more pressing, fueling the mass incarceration of those awaiting trial that could be better addressed by state legislatures or federal initiatives? What would you suggest as a policy for the Democratic Party, state or federally?
First of all, I'd like to say that the reforms that have worked in New Jersey work very well. There are 6 key things that it does. The reform establishes the presumption of innocence pre-trial for cases where someone is not granted a release. The reform requires that decisions on pre-trial release be made in 48 hours of arrest. that the reform establishes a right to an attorney during bail hearings. I think it's ridiculous that people aren't getting an attorney during their bail hearing, which happens far too often because it's considered a preliminary hearing. Fourth, in cases where the judge determines that pretrial release with no conditions is insufficient, then to impose the least restrictive conditions. And that works very well so far. And yeah, that's my belief. And then since I have a little bit of extra time, I want to address the last thing that my opponent said. He says that you get your money back when you post bail after your trial. I just want to say that for low-income people, that is not the case because low-income people tend to use services called bail bondsmen, which bring in about $2 billion annually every year. And so when you pay a bail bondsman, you pay them 10% of your posted bail rate. That's money you never get back, even if you're found innocent. So that's a horrible policy, and that's what we're talking about with the inequality of the bail system. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Your final moderated question. So you mentioned that you think there are better alternatives to cash bail. What specific criminal justice reforms do you think should be implemented to account for racial and economic disparities in the law?
I think that I'm going to fall back on some of my other conservative ideas, and that a lot of conservatives want to look into criminal justice reform, want to look at the alternatives such as risk assessments. Like I said, let's take a look at that. Let's figure out why the system isn't working the way that it's working, or it's working the way that it is and not the way that it's supposed to. Let's fix those pretrial services. Let's get more lawyers in that courtroom. I think everyone has a constitutional right to a speedy trial. I think everyone has a constitutional right to fair representation. And I think that those are all things that we've gotten away from. So it seems to me that the issues aren't with cash bail. Most issues that are being brought up, even the issue and the question, is not with cash bail itself. It's with the environment that has arisen around cash bail. Even bail bondsmen, that's not cash bail. That's a system that's arisen around. And maybe that's something that the government should look into.
It only exists because of cash bail.
Yeah, but that's not something that cash bail in and of itself. Regulation of cash bail doesn't fix the bail bond. Fixing the bail bonds would fix that.
Getting rid of
So I think in this case,
This is not
I think in this
positive.
case,
You will get 10 extra seconds.
I think working through that risk management, some better alternatives of keeping track of convicts, because again, I go back to the idea that if you were in this situation, you made a bad decision, and so you've got to, in some sense, pay for that bad decision. And if it turns out that you are totally exonerated, then there are already systems in place that protect you.
Thank you. Please give our debaters a round of applause. And with that, as our final topic, we have officially concluded our fall 2023 debates. So can we please give another round of applause for all of our debaters? Yeah, please come up here. We'll give them another round of applause while we stand up here. Okay. They had other commitments. Okay. Do you want to thank We want to thank our debaters today for their participation tonight and for their willingness to promote bipartisan discourse at USC. I would also like to thank our co-hosts, the USC Political Union, the USC Center for a Political Future, Trojan Democrats, the USC College Republicans, Glimpse from the Globe, and our PSA team. And finally, everyone up on the stage would like to thank you, the audience, for coming and contributing to a respectful and tolerant space. Please give yourselves a round of applause.
And stay involved in politics at USC. The door at the Center for Political Future is always open at SOS B15. But yeah, we hope to see you again next semester. This happens every single semester. So fight on, show up again.
Right on. Thank you guys.